Hello people of YouTube and welcome to Curiosity in Advance 2022. This is the 9th edition of Curiosity in Advance, so one more year and we'll have been doing this for a full decade, which is insane to think about. For the uninitiated amongst you, the way this works is last year I asked myself a couple of questions which will be answered right now. And then towards the end of the video, I will ask some more questions to my next year self that will be answered in next year's video. And then this year there is a small twist because I am not just going to answer my own questions from last year, but since I asked you guys to leave some questions for this year's me in the comments of last year's video, this is very confusing timeline-wise, I am going to answer some of your viewer questions as well. And it also brings me to an early call to action for you guys. If you have any questions for next year's Tom, 27-year-old Tom, put them in the comments of this video below and I will get to them next year. Let's dive in and start with the questions I asked myself a year ago. So question number 1 for 26-year-old me. Do you have a motorcycle yet? I imagine you've ridden your dad's motorcycle again while you've been in the Netherlands, hopefully. And you've probably given Frank's motorcycle a test ride. You keep buying other stuff that you need, and you'll probably be facilitating a fairly expensive move to Norway sometime in the next year. So, have you even been able to save up for a motorcycle yourself? Yes, I have finally gotten around to buying myself my own motorcycle, and I love it very much. The ones amongst you who have been watching this channel throughout the last year already know what it is. The ones who don't, I will get to the details of it later because there is a viewer question about this exact thing. And to address the rest of the question, yes, I have also ridden my dad's Ducati a bit, but not nearly as much as I would have hoped. And I have indeed also ridden Frank's Honda CBF 600, which compared to my dad's Ducati and especially my own motorcycle is a very heavy, kind of sluggish, kind of hard to finally control motorcycle. But it's also incredibly comfortable and it corners like it's on wheels. It is on wheels, you idiot. But it's also incredibly comfortable and it corners like it's on rails and it just feels ready to travel all across Europe with, which Frank has already started doing with it because he traveled to Trondheim on that motorcycle from the Netherlands last August, which casually made him add about 4,000 kilometers to his odometer. And that just seems like a crazy undertaking, but I think he enjoyed himself and I'm very grateful that he came up, and many more motorcycle journeys are planned for the future. Speaking of stuff you need, and I feel like an insane consumer for this one, what camera stuff have you bought in the last year? Like I was hoping for last year, I did indeed get the 25, 50 and 75mm SLR Magic Micro Prime Cine lenses after I had already been using the 12mm for a bit. While I got those Cine lenses, I did get rid of my Fujifilm 35mm f2, which is more of a photography lens. I do kind of miss it, but for video work specifically, it sort of missed the mark and it didn't work super nicely for me personally. Optically, it was great. It was super light. Build quality was lovely, but particularly the focus mechanism of a fully manual lens like the SLR Magics, the one that I'm talking to right now is the 50mm, are just more pleasant in a way. However, I did get another photography lens just last week. I got the Fujifilm 16 to 80mm f4 zoom lens, which I didn't technically speaking buy myself, but was a form of prepayment for a photography freelance job. Since I didn't have any photography focused lenses or any lenses with autofocus, I figured this would be a good investment to make before actually doing the photography assignment. So I now have that lens. I am very happy with it. The photos came out great. Thank you for asking. And I'm also looking forward to testing it out with video stuff a bit more because it'll be nice to have a zoom lens, not have to switch out lenses all the time, especially when I'm traveling. And the image stabilization that that lens has on board is supposed to be really, really great. Anything else? I got some SmallRig LED panels, but I think I talked about that in last year's video already because I got them during Black Friday last year. I can't remember at the moment though. Anyway, there's one of them standing right next to this bulb light just out of frame, giving me a hair light to amplify the vibe that this is supposed to be giving off. I don't know if it's working very well, but it's an experiment. Also, Signa sold all of her old camera equipment, her Canon 70D and her Canon G7X, in the hopes that we might in the near future buy a second Fuji body, so that she has her own vessel for contributing to stuff like the monthly reviews, and it'll be easier to color grade because the color profiles of a second Fuji body would be very pleasant to work with in combination with my own Fuji body. It's a bit harder to combine stuff like a Canon 70D with the Fuji X-T4. Just two Fujis would be brilliant. But that's in the future. Next up, do you still work and live in Sweden, or have you managed to make the move back to Norway? I live in Norway now, and if you've seen the monthly review of April, you will have witnessed all of the hecticity of the entire moving process. In all honesty though, I remember particularly my sort of road trip part of the move very fondly, and I might be looking at this through some rose-colored glasses, but the trip in my rental van filled with all of my earthly possessions from Linköping to Norway just makes me sort of nostalgic and proud. And objectively I know that the road trip itself was kind of cumbersome and long and tiring, but something in the back of my mind is trying to tell me that it was also liberating and fulfilling and fun. And as a bonus question, have you been able to take advantage of that new ferry line that has been announced recently that will open in April and will take you directly from the south coast of Norway to Groningen? No, we moved to fucking Trondheim instead of to the south of Norway, so we currently live 800 kilometers from Kristiansand, where that ferry departs from, to the Netherlands. There is no reason for us to be using that ferry that was so conveniently opened for our traveling purposes. It was never our plan to move up to Trondheim, but both Signa and me found it very difficult to find work in the Oslo area or slightly further south. We applied for dozens and dozens of things, but just couldn't get through to anything. Signa applied for one job in Trondheim, got the job. I applied for maybe 3 or 4 jobs in Trondheim, got one interview, and that was the job I got immediately. So we're back here, and the ferry from Kristiansand to Groningen remains unused, which especially sucks because in this post-pandemic early onset of an economic recession environment we find ourselves in right now, flying from Trondheim to the Netherlands is prohibitively expensive, so I still don't get to see my family as much as I would be hoping I could. Just before we move on, I want to point out that I do enjoy living in Trondheim. This apartment is great, the city is lovely, the people we have nearby are fantastic. It just wasn't our goal, and I don't get to see my family as much as I'd hoped, so it's a bit of a mixed bag, all in all. Then question 4, which is a continuation from this year. Have you managed to make all of the travel plans with the people that want to meet up at the cabin work out? Sadly, this didn't pan out in the way we were hoping it might. But after New Year's at the cabin, Liz came to visit Frank and I in the Netherlands in April, which was lovely. And then in August, Ailey flew up to Trondheim to visit me and Signa. And of course, Frank rode up on his motorcycle, so he was there as well. So even though the bigger meeting at the cabin with internet friends plan has not yet panned out, and I'm getting more and more skeptical about it ever panning out in the way we were hoping it would, we are slowly getting to see our internet friends again, which that in itself is quite nice. Following up from that, have you managed to travel anywhere that isn't to your or to Signa's family? Like, have you managed to go to any places for the sake of going to another place? Because for obvious reasons, in the last 2 years, that hasn't happened. But you have a very deep craving for eating a nice baguette by a French lakeside. I still crave this so bad. There is very few things I want more in this life than crawling out of a tent in the morning, putting on a mocha pot, walking down to the campsite store and buying the freshest croissant a man can dream of. I am very much crossing my fingers for this to happen coming summer break. Otherwise, not really. We did a reasonably sized road trip around Norway last summer break. The decision for that journey instead of, for example, a journey abroad was made largely because of the financial constraints that were put upon us by our move up to Trondheim a couple months before. The exorbitant prices of flights that I was moaning about earlier in this video, and also just last minute planning. Our summer was a bit chaotic. Question 6 is, do you still do yoga? Since you stopped ice skating when you were like 16 or 17, you haven't really stuck with any sport at any sort of consistent basis. So doing yoga regularly has kind of, in a way, been breaking a streak in a positive way. So have you kept up with it? 25-year-old Tom, your back of the mind soothsaying skills are kind of funny, because no, of course I don't do yoga anymore, and you knew that. However, instead, like the influenceable hipster millennial that I still am, I picked up bouldering. Got some chalk, got some shoes, got a year-long subscription to the bouldering center that is a 30-second walk from my office, and now I'm trying to be dedicated to that. The good news is that it's fun. I find climbing quite enjoyable, and it's quite motivational to feel myself progressing every single time I go. So at the end of this video, I will ask myself the same question for next year, but this time around, I think actually I might still be doing bouldering regularly in a year from now. We'll see. As is tradition, what have been the most memorable moments of 2022? I'll try to omit anything that can actively be seen in the monthly reviews that I've been making, because for all of those memories, I can just go back and watch them happen. But I'll conjure up some of the memories that aren't committed to film, and obviously the memories that are most memorable are the ones that have most emotion attached to it, which should come as no surprise. Having that said, the first memory is me bursting out into tears in front of all of my now former colleagues in Sweden. Living in Linköping in Sweden was a roller coaster in many ways. I did love living in Linköping, but I also sat through a pandemic in Linköping mostly alone. Note that I'm not saying lonely, because I don't think I was most of the time, but still, going through that alone was not the greatest fun I can imagine having. And also, the job that I had in Linköping was the first proper grown-up job I had ever, and it was, for all intents and purposes, a really great first job to have. Every Tuesday at that company we would have what's called Info Fika, which is when everyone in the company came together to have some cake and coffee, talk about company things, and during the last one, during my last week, I was invited to come up and say something. And I didn't get many words out of my mouth before I just broke down completely. The second one is also kind of bittersweet. After Frank had been with us on his motorcycle in August, when he went home, I escorted him down the first 75 kilometers of the way. Firstly, those 75 kilometers were miserable because we just had the first night with sub-zero degrees. I was underdressed in my sort of three-season gear. Frank was very underdressed in his summer gear. And so we actually meant to ride a bit further. We intended to ride about 100 kilometers instead of 75, but after 75 we were just so cold that we needed to stop. We had tea and coffee and 2 hot chocolates, and then finally we were warm enough again. But of course, since Frank was on his way home, after we had our sit down and our chat and warm up session for about an hour, we rode off. Frank turned right and I turned left, and we rode away from each other. And that felt fucking weird. Of course, Frank and I have said goodbye to each other for these sort of semi-long term many times before. That is one of the great perks of me living abroad. However, that usually just involves one of us going away and not 2 of us actively riding away from each other. So this particular goodbye had a little scoop of extra sadness sprinkled over it. At the very least, during our hour of warming up, the sun had managed to warm up the world a little bit as well, so the ride home was not as terribly cold and miserable. Then I have another memory of riding motorcycles with Frank, which is more ubiquitously happy. Earlier in the year, we went down to Zwolle in the Netherlands, where there is a Royal Enfield dealer, and we test rode a Royal Enfield Interceptor 650 and a Royal Enfield Himalayan. Not only was that just really, really fun, but it also confirmed 2 things for me. The first being that the Royal Enfield Himalayan was not going to be my first motorcycle, which up until that point I thought it might be. And the second thing is that the Interceptor is probably going to be my second motorcycle, because I loved it very, very much, and I want it desperately, and I still want it desperately, so it's still very likely going to be my second motorcycle. But we'll, see what happens in a year or 2. Then, to counter the happy memory, a more ubiquitously sad one, and that is that I went to 2 funerals this year. And the last funeral I went to before this year was well over a decade ago. That in itself I feel quite lucky about. Not really having to worry about people dying around me for 10 years was very pleasant. But having had 2 funerals this year feels ominously foreboding of what's to come in the next little period. I don't want to make too big a deal of this, but I do want to just make note of the fact that this is playing in the back of my mind a lot at the moment. I want to finish the memories off with another happy one, and that is the one of going camping with my new colleagues just after summer break. That in itself was really lovely because it was a great way of getting to know some more colleagues, especially because I had only been at my new job for 3-4 months, so I didn't know them super well yet. So good team building exercise, but also it was my first time sleeping in a hammock, which I borrowed from one of my colleagues. And that was a revelation because I slept like a princess without a pee. And I really want a hammock for myself now. The whole hammock setup was super small, so it'd be very suitable for stuff like motorcycle camping. And a hammock and a tarp are very much on my wish list right now. So side note for any friends and family that are watching, my birthday is coming up fairly soon. Just putting it out there. All right, that's it for all of the questions I asked myself. Let us move on to the questions you guys asked me last year and answer some of those. So first up, Liz asks, when do you think Signe and you will be able to build a van for traveling in? So there are a few things here. Firstly, adding a car to our fleet next to the Mini would cripple our already slightly scuffed finances. Secondly, there are a few bigger fish that we would like to fry first. Primarily moving to the south of Norway and buying a house of our own so that we can stop yeeting money into the cavern that is renting houses. So while building a van for camping purposes is still very much a dream, I would be kind of surprised if it happens in less than like 4 years from now. I will say though that in 4 or so years it's quite likely that the second-hand market will have a lot more electric vans in it because there are currently a lot of electric vans being released new. I particularly like the Volkswagen ID Buzz just because it's so pretty, so maybe by the time we're ready, something like that will be available to us. Signe asks many things. The first is, where do you currently live? Which I've already said, Trondheim. And the second thing is, are you happy with your new job? And the answer to that is yes, but I wish it wasn't in Trondheim. She also asks, did I get one of the 10 million jobs I'm currently applying for? And again, yes, you got the one you applied for in Trondheim. Also, Signe, if you want questions about yourself answered in a format like this, I can really recommend starting something like Curiosity in Advance. I personally find it a very fulfilling format to film every year. Jesus, that's a mouthful. But I can recommend doing it too. Len asks, did you revisit anything nostalgic this year and how was your experience with it this time around? And yes, I did. Actually, right at this moment, Signe and I are rewatching Doctor Who and Gilmore Girls. And particularly with Gilmore Girls, I feel a lot more nuanced about the characters. I think when I watched it last time, more of the characters I perceived as unanimously bad or good people, and now I can see the grey in between. There's just, I think, a lot more nuance beneath the surface that I wasn't really able to see the first time I watched Gilmore Girls. Also, a completely other branch of nostalgia, there is a cafe here in town that is called Ny Muser, which was the first cafe in Trondheim I ever visited well over 7 years ago at this point, before we even lived here the first time around. So naturally, we have been back to Ny Muser a few times. The nostalgia makes it hard not to go there. It is also just a good cafe. They have nice coffee, they have great tea, they have a lot of different cakes, they have really good soups as well. So nostalgia or not, it's a good place to go. And lastly, Frank's self-proclaimed most important question: Svartbilen or Continental GT? For context, the Husqvarna Svartbilen 401 and the Royal Enfield Continental GT are 2 motorcycles I have been very interested in purchasing for myself. Like I said before, Frank and I managed to test ride not the Continental GT, but its closely related brother, the Interceptor. But we both haven't actually managed to ride something adjacent to the Husqvarna Svartbilen 401. We do actually have some hopes and vague plans for renting one sometime in the next year, but that's sort of by the by for now. So the actual answer to Frank's question is neither. because the bike I actually ended up buying for myself is a Honda CRF 250L. It is slower, lighter, and significantly more focused for off-road riding than the other two bikes that Frank actually asked about. It's a really good motorcycle for commuting, which is what I've used it a lot for in the last half year. It is also fantastic as just a tool for becoming a better motorcyclist on, because it's not too intimidating. And I love it, and I miss it because it is currently December, and in Norway that means you have to put away your motorcycle because it's too fucking cold to do anything with it. I'm thinking of keeping that bike for one more season and then selling it and getting some form of Royal Enfield in return. But as with all of the answers I've given in this video, that's in the future, and we'll see how that actually pans out. Well now, that is it for all of the answers I have to give for this year. I have been recording for well over an hour already. Let's move on to the questions I have for 27-year-old me, and also remind you to put your questions for 27-year-old me down in the comments below. Thank you. So hello 27-year-old Tom. Are you still living in Trondheim? I'm guessing you do, but I'm also guessing that there are slightly more concrete plans for where you are going to live in the middle distant future. So are there any of those plans, and can you share them with us? Do you still do bouldering, and if so, did you get any better? Like I said before, I'm actually kind of optimistic about this one, partly because I have forced my own hand by getting a year pass to the bouldering center, so I have to kind of be dedicated to it for at least a year, because otherwise I'm just throwing that money I spent on it into the void, and that is not fun for anyone involved. Just for my own reference in the future, you can currently solve about half of the blue problems at your bouldering gym, which equates to a level of 6A or 6B. Thereabouts. I will add that you aren't solving them very graciously, so if you are still at the same level but can solve the same problems with more finesse, that's also improvement. Have you undertaken any longer motorcycle journeys or done any motorcycle camping? You're currently planning on riding down to the cabin in June and meeting Frank at the cabin, as he will come riding up and spending some time there motorcycling around that area for a while. And that's a fairly big trip, so did that pan out? Along the same vein, do you still have your same motorcycle, the Honda CRF 250L? Have you finally managed to eat that baguette by a little French river? And still along the same vein, have you and Signe done any more random local camping together? I didn't ask any language questions to myself last year, so let's do one again for this year. How's the Norwegian going? Because for the first time ever, you are actually getting a lot of real practice in with your Norwegian. So your ability to speak and to understand the locals is actually improving quite significantly at this point in time. And as the tradition goes, what are the most memorable moments of 2023? The recording sessions for these Curiosity in Advance videos are getting longer and longer every year, but honestly, the more I do them, the more I want to do them, so I wouldn't be surprised if they keep on getting longer into the future. Once again, if you have any, don't forget to put your questions to 2023 Tom, 27-year-old Tom, in the comments down below. I'd be very grateful for them, and I'd be very happy to answer them in a year from now. And other than that, thank you ever so much for sticking with me to the end. Don't forget to push some of the positive buttons down below, and I will see you in the next one. Ciao!